Thanks for coming to our first of what are going to be a number of confronting panel discussions. It's kind of a series. We're going to call it Confronting, and then we're going to confront different things. These are issues of importance that are confronting the church today, and that we feel that English history and philosophy, roughly the humanities at Tyndale, has a unique ability to speak into that issue and to be helpful. So today we're going to talk about confronting climate change, but future topics are going to include confronting transgenderism, for example, confronting woke Christianity, confronting language acknowledgements. All of these things that are kind of controversial within the Christian community, we're going to try to speak into those and be helpful. So today, confronting climate change, and we're going to have me respond first on an ethical level, then Dr. Krauss is going to talk about the economics of climate change, and then Dr. Masson, the pragmatics of it. If you don't know anything about climate change, what you might know is things you've seen on television, certain activists and protests. Here's 3 individuals from the End Fossil Fuels group, and they interrupted a Coco Gauff match a couple of years ago at the US Open, and it took 45 minutes to get them out of the venue because one of them had glued their feet to the floor. So it took some time to sort of detach them. Here's another 2 from Just Stop Oil protesters. They went to the National Gallery in London and they threw soup on one of the most famous of Van Gogh's paintings. They subsequently spent, I think it was like one of them spent 20 months in prison and the other 22 months, but then 2 of their colleagues followed that up by protesting the fact that they were in prison, and they did something similar with ball-peen hammers. These paintings are all covered by a sheet of glass, and they took the ball-peen hammers to the glass. I don't know what happened to them. A couple of years back, in 2018, when Greta Thunberg was 15 years old, she retweeted with approval this following quote: "A top climate scientist is warning that climate change will wipe out all of humanity unless we stop using fossil fuels over the next 5 years." 5 years from the year 2018 would have been the year 2023. And so all of humanity, so far as I can tell, did not end in 2023. Closer to home, in our chapel a number of years back, one of the chapel speakers confessed to an addiction. That doesn't often happen in a chapel. But this individual said, "I have an addiction to a particular substance which I abuse." Of course, it's never good to abuse substances. "It hurts me and it hurts others. I'm addicted to oil, in particular gasoline. And I'm told I'm not the only one at Tyndale who suffers from this addiction." The addiction is, if you drive your car to work like I have for the past 25 years, my gas-powered vehicle, and I go back and forth for 25 years, I'm addicted to gasoline and it hurts other people. "But I signed a statement," he says, "saying that I believe that God is at work in creation to redeem the creation." All the faculty at Tyndale have to sign that doctrinal statement, and that's point number 4, and that's correct. That's what it says in point 4. Read it. It says that I'm to be a steward of God's creation. So the punchline there is that I am violating the doctrinal statement, I'm acting contrary to Scripture, and I'm just in general doing something that's morally wrong because, as we all know, it's morally wrong to hurt yourself and to hurt others. We've been talking about this for a long time, he says, creation care. So there's no argument here, but there's sort of an assertion of the conclusion of the argument, namely that some violation of the doctrinal statement or our general moral duties is at stake, but it has something to do with creation care. Now, we're not told in that sermon podcast what that is, but if we turn to the Evangelical Environmental Network, they give us a hint about what creation care is all about. And what they say on their website is the Bible proclaims that human beings have a special role and a special responsibility in God's creation, since they're created in God's image and have free will. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. Human beings are called to care for the rest of God's creation, not to abuse or destroy it. And all I can say to that is yay and amen. There's nothing wrong with those premises, but perhaps those premises could be used, fashioned together into an argument for a creation care conclusion. We better get clear about what climate change is, though, and the best definition of it comes from the climate philosopher Stephen Gardner. He's the leading philosopher of climate in the world today. And he defines it as follows. The term climate change captures the fact that it is human interference in the climate system itself that is the crucial issue. So the climate is always changing, but what we're talking about is human-induced climate change, the result of burning fossil fuels, for example, or driving gas-powered vehicles and emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. The fundamental problem is that it is now possible for humans to alter the underlying dynamics of the planet's climate and therefore the basic life support system for themselves and all other forms of life on Earth. And so I propose to just stipulate all the data related to climate change. So I'm not a climate denier, if that's what your bubble over your head is thinking right now. This is the 1973 Chrysler Newport that I learned to drive on. My dad was an Exxon oil executive, and the 1973 Chrysler Newport, if you drove around the block, you were down about a quarter of a tank of gas. And when you put your foot on the gas, all this black smoke came out of the tailpipe because we didn't know anything about filtering in those days. So what I want to do now is try to fashion a climate argument that I'm not allowed to drive my dad's 1973 Chrysler Newport on Sunday afternoon just for the fun of it. I'm not taking my kids to the hospital. I'm not driving to work so that I can have a job, so that I can pay the rent, so that I can feed my family so they don't die. I'm just saying just for the fun of it and for no other reason. Maybe because I just want to put in my 8-track tape of Boston's debut album and listen to More Than a Feeling. Okay. I'm taking some the example and some of the motivation here and inspiration from a paper by Walter Sinnott Armstrong entitled "It's Not My Fault: Global Warming and Individual Moral Responsibility." So looking at the climate change data from the Creation Care website, I think those two green premises there would give us something like a start on an argument to the conclusion that I'm morally obligated not to take out the Newport on Sunday afternoon. So step one, human beings have a moral obligation to care for God's creation. No doubt about that. Quote, creation care means caring for all of God's creation by stopping and preventing activities that are harmful to it. I got no problem with that. And if we grant that climate change is harmful to God's creation, and I'm not denying that, then this follows. Human beings, as a collective whole, have a moral obligation to stop and prevent climate change. So let's just start from point 3. It's now got a foundation in the creation care premises. I want to look at the inference from 3 to 4. Human beings have a moral obligation to stop and prevent climate change. Therefore, I do. And then from the fact that I have that moral obligation, it means I can't take out the Newport on Sunday afternoon just for the fun of it. So take a look at that inference from 3 to 4 first. Human beings collectively have that obligation. Therefore, I have the same moral obligation to stop and prevent climate change. And I want to suggest that that is an invalid inference. So you can't move from 3 to 4. And the reason for that is it's not true that our collective obligations as human beings always entail that I have that very same obligation. For example, human beings as a whole might have the obligation to procreate so as not to cause our human species to go out of existence. But it doesn't follow that I have the obligation not to procreate. Human beings as a whole do, otherwise there's just no human beings around anymore, but it doesn't follow that I do. So collective obligations don't always entail individual obligations. Furthermore, the reason we know this is because it violates something called Kant's law. And the Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, said, I can't have a moral obligation to do something unless I can do it, unless it's within my power to do it. So if I ought to do some action A, it must be within my power to do that action. Or on the flip side, if it's not within my power to perform a certain action, then I can't have a moral obligation to perform the action that I don't have the power to perform. And here's the thing, it's not within my power to stop or prevent climate change. I can't do that. I can't do that by not taking out my dad's Newport, and I can't do it. It's just too large, too grand of a scale problem for me to do anything about stopping or preventing it. So since I can't stop or prevent it, I don't have a moral obligation to stop or prevent it. Okay, let's look at the final inference. Let's suppose, I'll grant you, I have a moral obligation to stop and prevent climate change. Stipulate that for the purposes of argument. How does it follow at step 5 that I have a moral obligation not to drive dad's gas-guzzling 1973 Chrysler Newport just for the fun of it this Sunday afternoon? Well, that inference depends on a general principle, which namely that it's wrong to cause climate change, which in turn harms people. It creates things like melting polar ice caps, tornadoes, hurricanes, droughts, and the like. But you see, taking my dad's car out on the weekend just for the fun of it isn't going to cause climate change. Walter Sinnott Armstrong, who I mentioned before, says, "No storms or floods or droughts or heat waves can be traced to my individual act of driving. And it is these climate changes that cause harms to people." Now, I know what you're thinking. You're saying, yeah, you're not going to cause climate change by driving to work at Tyndale or taking dad's car out for a joyride, but you're going to contribute to the problem. You're going to make it worse. But the fact is, it's not going. Climate change and the effects of climate change are not going to be any worse whether I drove or I didn't drive on Sunday afternoon. Furthermore, to say that it would be a moral obligation on my part and I would be doing something morally wrong confuses the following two things, and I'm just about done. It confuses my driving the Newport as a part of a cause of a harm. So if you look at the top here, there's my driving the Newport, and it emits a certain amount of CO2 and emissions, and that's part of this overall total collection of greenhouse gases, and it's that collection that causes the wildfire, let's say. So it's true that my driving the Newport is part of a cause which results in a certain harm, but it doesn't follow that my driving the Newport is the cause of the part of that harm. Do you see the difference? I could be part of a cause that resulted in a harm without causing part of that harm. So if you just look at the left-hand side there, where that line is dividing it into a segment, my driving the Newport isn't 1/8 of the harm of that forest fire. So that kind of an inference doesn't work. Now, if you don't like that counterexample, you can try this one. Starting at the top left, let's say you're walking by a river and you decide you don't want your water anymore, so you pour your water bottle into the river. That is part of the cause, which is the tidal wave down at the base of the river, which destroys this little town there. So I'm part of a cause of a harm. It doesn't follow that I'm causing 1/8 of the part of that harm. One more example. Look at the lowly neuron at the top left there. It's part of an overall array of neurons, which is the cause of an image of an apple in my mind, let's say. It doesn't follow that single neuron is the cause of part of the image of the apple. So that final inference from step number 4 to step number 5 is invalid. So the creation care argument that I'm not allowed to take out the 1973 Chrysler Newport, this argument here is invalid. Nothing wrong with the first two steps, nothing wrong with the inference to step 3. It's those final two steps that are the difficulty. And I'm going to turn things over now to Dr. Krause.
Okay, my talk, the title is Do Climate Change Activists Care About the Poor? It is heartbreaking how climate change alarmists have hurt so many people. On the one hand, you can see it in the rhetoric when commentators minimize the terrorism of Fulani Muslims killing Christians in Nigeria by saying the violence is simply a result of climate change forcing farmers and herdsmen to find land. On the other hand, you can see the harm done to poor people by reviewing evidence-based research. Economic facts indicate that it is not economically feasible to pursue net zero climate policies that demand the elimination of fossil fuel energy. Poor people take the brunt of misguided climate policy. Are climate change alarmists aware of the disastrous effects that their climate change policies have on economies? Since 2020, we received an unpleasant dose of so-called expert information telling us we must trust and follow the science. With climate change activism, this reverential approach began in the 1970s with the complicity of corporate media and state education. If you have money, media, and state education on your side, you can persuade people that dressed up Marxist ideas are reasonable. By embracing the climate change narrative, you will not be an oppressor. I recall in junior high school 50 years ago, doomsday teachers telling me that we would shortly experience the coming of an ice age. Apparently, it was the right time to have 20 pairs of long johns in your dresser. Leonard Nimoy, the popular Star Trek actor who played Spock, warned us in a video that with the Earth growing colder, there would be hunger and death on a scale never seen before in history. And you can still find this video on YouTube. 3 years before Nimoy's warning, Nature magazine noted a flurry of academic papers indicating the Earth was cooling. Now, over the decades, many stories and news magazines gave accounts of climate change doom. Popular climate activist Paul Ehrlich wrote in the 1970s that England would not exist in the year 2000. A future science advisor to President Barack Obama declared in 1986 that climate-induced famines could kill as many as 1 million people before the year 2020. In 2014, Newsweek magazine asked, "Is it too late to save our cities from sea level rise?" Now, those who push the climate change narrative believe their policies will make a better world. They argue that non-renewable fossil fuels cause pollution, destroy the environment, deplete our resources, and thus are unsustainable and represent a dangerous addiction. Unfortunately, climate change activists have unrealistic ideas that solar, wind, and other non-fossil fuel forms of energy can substitute fossil fuel energy soon. History demonstrates that no one has figured out a cost-effective, scalable process to turn sunlight and wind into cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. Fossil fuels, which are super concentrated ancient dead plants, economically outperforms by a large margin the energy that climate activists favor. Among the nonconformists and dissenters who challenge the climate change narrative are those who argue we need more energy rather than less energy. They understand that energy poverty can be especially devastating for poor people. Researchers such as Alec Epstein have made the moral case for fossil fuels, arguing the standard of living globally would see much improvement if more fossil fuels were used. Those who applaud the benefits of fossil fuel energy argue the following: using fossil fuels outweigh the risk. Technology makes pollution a smaller problem. There is enough fossil fuels for many decades, and sun and wind energy are intermittent and unreliable. They need a backup. Boiled down, the main economic argument is that fossil fuels give billions of people cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. Affordable energy brings greater wealth for innovation, which results in more environmental and other problems getting solved. There is plenty of evidence of a strong correlation between fossil fuel use and life expectancy, and between fossil fuel use and income. Epstein writes, "Not only in China and India, but around the world, hundreds of millions of individuals in industrializing countries have gotten their first light bulb, their first refrigerator, their first decent paying job, their first year with clean drinking water on a full stomach." End of quote. And when electricity consumption increases, infant mortality decreases. Conversely, citizens of countries with less energy have shorter lifespans and a lower standard of living. The power of fossil fuel machines built a durable civilization that promoted human flourishing and lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. One example is the oil powered mechanization that caused a dramatic increase in the amount of farmland cultivated. No less marvelous is gas based fertilization. The amount of food increased by synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is remarkable. The gas powered machines at harvest time made food much more affordable. In one day, a single person operating a modern combine harvester can reap enough wheat to make 500,000 loaves. To starve our machines of energy would be to starve ourselves. More energy means more ability to improve life, and less energy contributes to greater suffering and death. The debate on what is the cheapest and most reliable energy matters especially for poor people. Cheaper and reliable energy matters less to the rich. Low-income people benefit the most from modern plumbing. The rich had always servants to carry their water. The rich could always afford musicians and actors to entertain them. Electricity brought radio and television to the masses. In many other ways, technology and affordable energy gave ordinary people things that only the rich and powerful had. Climate change activists want governments to reduce reliable and cheap energy. But in countries where there has been costly investment in wind and solar energy, it is the ordinary tax-paying citizen who are hit the hardest. It is not an exaggeration to say that many suffer when there are comprehensive bans on the plentiful and affordable energy that we get from fossil fuels. As one example, and I could have used the example of Canada, but I chose Germany. Germany has been a leader of climate change policies. With its national climate change that passed in 2019, its goal is to reach net greenhouse gas neutrality by 2045. It has set interim targets of cutting emissions by at least 65% by 2030 and 88% by 2040 compared to 1990 levels. Politico reported last year that wind and solar power provided 47% of Germany's electricity in 2024, up from 31% in 2021. So the question is, how is the German economy doing? In the post-World War II period, Germany has been the economic powerhouse of Europe. But in recent years, Germany has become one of the world's worst economic performers among major developed economies. Professor Bjorn Lomborg noted that electricity costs are almost 3 times the US average. Various think tanks reveal the economic underperformance of German businesses, with some closing or relocating operations outside the EU. Companies such as Volkswagen and Mercedes have taken steps to address rising costs and made significant new investments in the United States. Other German companies have announced layoffs and plant closures in 2023 due to high energy costs. These developments sent shockwaves throughout Germany, which has historically prided itself on being the manufacturing powerhouse of the EU. Remarkably, this has not stopped German politicians from downplaying the high energy costs and using trickery to claim that there will actually be a net benefit. An honest politician is rarer than a 3-legged dog that studies Latin. There's no shortage of studies on how drastic carbon cuts will cause significant hunger and food insecurity. Carbon taxes on consumers and industries guarantee a higher cost of living and thus the lowering of living standards. In Germany and elsewhere, high energy prices literally kill people. In a 2020 issue of Energy Economics, research found that one of the leading causes of death in the winter is cold homes. the call for global action to combat climate change has been persistent. Climate change alarmists focus on the risk rather than the benefits of fossil fuels. For leftist politicians, it helps that most people graduate from high school or university without learning basic economics. Climate change ideology is a powerful force praised by many journalists and education elites, buoyed by one form or another of Marxism. If coercion or censorship are necessary, so be it. Climate change activists employ a clever strategy to undermine free market capitalism. They are also masters of propaganda. It is another topic, but we witnessed elites assuring us that mRNA injections were safe and effective. In conclusion, the economic numbers suggest that it is not economically feasible to pursue net zero climate policies that are driven more by ideology than common sense. Climate policies especially hurt the poor because higher energy prices have a disproportionate negative impact on the poor. Satan's playbook is to have chaos and destruction, but followers of Christ can make a difference in exposing manipulative and harmful policies. Thank you.
Is morally problematic insofar as it appeals to the goodness of stopping the destruction of the planet through human advance, civilizationally, through growing wealth and so forth. But it appeals to an idea of the goodness of nature, which is an idea that is pantheistic in its character. I'll get this from Lewis, from Book 2 of Mere Christianity. He talks about a basis for morality in different views, and one of them is the Christian view. But the main objection he sees is that of pantheism, which sees God in the universe and the universe in God. And he demonstrates that if that is the case, that the universe is good, and that what we call good and evil is then just a human projection. There are no such things as good and evil per se. And we can't really, there are feelings about good and evil, but they aren't really good and evil. So you may as well just say that cancer, by, we try and treat cancer, but if we're killing cancer, we could say that we're killing something that's good, and really we're treating the cancer for saving the patient. It talks about all sorts of issues that arise from the problem that if we don't think that good and evil are absolutes, we just see them as a human perspective thing, then we're effectively pantheists. It seems to me that the environmentalists, in their view of the environment, see nature as an absolute good, and to do anything that infringes upon it is therefore ipso facto evil. But their view of good and evil is already subjective. And so the questions that arise from their point of view are to be brought into question here. I said I was going to talk about the pragmatic argument. I was going to talk about this, having seen this, because anyone who's just been in my class will see this as a direct expression of a Buddhist man on the top of the mountain expressing the human view of these things. And I think that that's appropriate because this is a pantheist view of nature, the Buddhist view of nature, which is held by our contemporaries as well. Sorry?
My pragmatic cases boil down to the impossibility of doing what we purport to be doing, even by their own standards. So at the present way of dealing with climate change, with respect to, let's talk about driving, because that was Rich's example to begin with, is to transition to electronic vehicles, right? We're supposed to transition to electronic vehicles, and in order to do so, we need a grid sufficient to be able to handle those electronic vehicles. But despite the billions that have been spent thus far on those electronic vehicles and the grid, there is no grid really sufficient to scale up so that it would be sufficient to do that, despite the billions that are spent there. And furthermore, the EVs are actually worse for the environment than the vehicles that use the gasoline. not only in the materials that are used for them. So we could talk about the batteries, which are from rare earth minerals and so forth, which requires the exploitation of people in Africa and other places, an enormous cost, and environmental cost at that matter. So the extraction of these things has a huge cost on cost to the environment, even in terms of carbon monoxide and dioxide production. Furthermore, the use of the grid, the electronic things, that requires energy from somewhere. Where's the energy coming from? It would require further draw on it. So it's just pushing the problem down the road per se. And I will say that actually the artificial intelligence just magnifies the problem because it uses how much power on top of all that. We could talk about artificial intelligence as the big climate change problem because it uses more water than anything else. In order to do artificial intelligence, you have to have vast batteries and resources that we don't even have anything like. So this is the first objection, is that it's practically impossible. And if you build one of these cars and you drive one of these cars, what they do is they actually degrade the roads at an accelerated rate because each vehicle costs or weighs 500 to 1,000 pounds more than every other vehicle. So it degrades the roads at an accelerated rate. You might have noticed that your roads are falling apart. Furthermore, it degrades the brakes and the tires at an accelerated rate, which also is a problem of climate change. So nobody talks about those things, but they're right out there already as pragmatic objections to this. And they deteriorate the infrastructure on which other people depend. So the cost of electricity goes up. We already talked about that, the growing poverty that ensues because of that. And so when they come to the statistics and say, well, we're getting better and we're meeting our targets with respect to the amount of energy that's used for clean energy as opposed to the polluting types of energy, the reason we're doing better is because we're actually producing less energy. So the reason that Germany is succeeding in its climate change projections is because the country is becoming poorer by the year. So in terms of a percentage of energy that comes from non-fossil fuels, yes, it's doing better. But the percentage overall it's because they're growing more and more poor. So the percentage of energy comes, yes. So the transition to clean energy, as I think Eric made clear, condemns the majority of humanity to poverty and misery. It condemns it to poverty and misery. It's one of my chief objections to the whole climate change thing. It's not that we don't care for the earth. Of course we do. But our chief concern is to take care of our fellow human beings. And as it stands, the approach to reduce the carbon disaster that's on the horizon, 2012, back in 1999, it was also given 5 years, by the way. I had a slide, it was just blurry, it didn't get admitted. But the same projection, the same timeline, it was also, we have to do something right now and so forth. Technology doesn't exist to do it. Well, we're going to have to do it anyway to save the planet. The consequence of the target is that people are going to be condemned to poverty and misery. That's just so question, is that an unintended consequence or is it an intended consequence? That's the question, because the poverty is clear. I think it's an intended consequence, and it's because of the pantheistic view that I cited at the beginning, because human beings are seen to be of no greater value than this guy. There's no greater value on a human being, because it all depends on what you think a human being is, whether the human being has value or not, whether human flourishing is a good for human society to aim for, or whether it's something that we ought to put alongside one other thing. I'll give one final pragmatic objection to the electronic vehicles. There's a better way of doing things that already exists than moving to solar and wind, which obviously are dependent on changeable things. Like the sun has to be shining, the wind has to be blowing. You don't have energy if those things aren't happening. It's called nuclear, advanced nuclear energy. It can be done cleanly, safely, and you can scale it. And the result of that would be energy so abundant that people would flourish and not perish. And it exists there. Why is it not being seized upon by the people who are concerned with climate change? Because there is no carbon footprint from nuclear energy, advanced nuclear energy. Don't think of 3 Mile Island, those nuclear reactors. Look up advanced nuclear energy. It's clean, it's efficient, and it produces electrical energy in a superabundance. It would result in the flourishing of life, and it would not harm the environment whatsoever in terms of climate or carbon, if that's actually a problem. So why isn't it happening? Here's my answer. It would not require a coercive, advanced bureaucracy to enforce. It wouldn't require huge taxes. It wouldn't require a moral code that is conducive with pantheism. It would allow for freedom and individual choice in that. Is there actually an agenda against Christianity in the environmentalist movement? I think that there's a clear one. I could cite various other things here. What time do I go to? I'm good to 12. Beautiful. In the something called the Anthropocene, there's a theory that is emerging in something called posthumanism. People in Christian circles talk about postmodernism as the great evil, right? Because it's irrational, it's relativistic, and so forth. Postmodernism has not been talked about in the academy since the year 2000. It's literally a dead subject. That's 25 years. What has come in its wake are transhumanism and posthumanism, and varieties of cultural Marxism. But the posthumanism is the one that I think is most conducive with this, because again, it posits that a human being is of no greater significance than Ducky. Because it's not only life forms, it's also inanimate objects. They will say that consciousness in cyberspace is as much an expression of human nature as a physical human being. So it begs the question of not only what good and evil is, but what is it, the thing that it is that we're striving to preserve? Is it human beings, or is it some other thing? And I think it's clear in the climate change ideology that it's another thing. We want to save nature. But why is nature seen to be good? Why is it not seen in the word nature and the associations with it good are entirely the product of the Romantic period. It doesn't predate it. If you doubt me, read C.S. Lewis on the discussion of nature, and he will inform you that nature as a good thing, solely good, and wholly at that, is a Romantic fiction. It's a fiction we still hold to, but it is nonetheless a fiction. And if we hold to that fiction, then again, we divinize nature, and we can't come up with a notion of good and evil outside nature, which traps us in an immanent sphere, and we can't even appeal to metaphysics or ideas of transcendent goods. Ideas like goodness, justice, beauty, truth, those things are just subjective feelings that we have about things. The real good is in nature. And of course, this is a great portrait of it, because we have a Buddhist man at the top of, looks like Mount Everest, looking down on creation. It's not a very good sublime portrait, but I could stick it alongside that, and it's clearly being portrayed of that. So I think our policymakers are incompetent. They're self-interested because it results in jobs. Or they're just gaslighting us. They're appealing to notions of goodness, how we ought to behave. Dr. Davis showed us the Kantian fallacy of this, that an ought doesn't mean that we can do it. Or there's something more alarming in the agenda, which is my personal belief, which is that it is demonic. I think it's demonic. My proof of this is that it seeks the elimination of human life, not maybe entirely, but sees the reduction of human nature rather than the flourishing of human nature as a good thing. I see no warrant for that in Scripture whatsoever, anywhere. Man is made in the image of God. We're to be fruitful and multiply and fill and subdue the earth. That's the first commandment given in Scripture. The very first. It's not revoked. God calls that good. The fall does not destroy the first commandment. It's given before the fall. But climate change agenda would present the idea of having fewer people as a good thing. Why? Because human beings are are diminishing the truly good thing, which is nature, which we're a part of. So there's all sorts of logical contradictions there. But you're getting my point. I think I've said enough on this. I just want to kick it off anyway. So I'll end early.
Okay, we're done. Thanks for coming.